And do you think we're losing a lot by not using some of our other like senses? Touch.
I I think biologically, we have a tendency to use it or lose it naturally. That's just how the body has a tendency to function. That's how we've evolved over thousands of years.
So how do you? What practices do you take, right, to stay aligned with your taste in a noisy environment?
Something that I often do as well as a creative and like through the noise of just, the world being as chaotic and as 24/7 as it is today is I will step away from that digital world and I will go.
Sara Baumann, also known as Sparky, former occupational therapist turned full-time artist, founder of Women and Weapons, exploring femininity and power through digital and physical mediums. In our discussion, we talk about her art practice, switching careers, and how she infuses her heritage to experiment with new tools, express herself, and empower the people around her.
Who oftentimes in the media or in advertisements was portrayed as being lesser than, a woman that's meant to be quiet and stay in the kitchen. I liked the juxtaposition of that woman with a very strong, traditionally masculine weapon. And I've come to find that with the majority of my collections, whether it be my heritage collection, which you can see a little bit of it over
Yep.
here, or my sensory collection, which is over here, all of them have started with a inkling of an idea and come out with a yes, this is how I am perceiving the world and perceiving.
So before we go deep in my conversation with Sarah, quick ask. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on a podcast app, please follow. This conversation with Sara Baumann is one of many that are shaping a book I'm writing on how we find meaning and purpose as we go deeper into the automation and intelligence era. It's called Practice Ground, and the book is coming later this year, 2026. Don't miss it. Now back to my interview with Sarah. I have an interesting person on to interview today, Sara Baumann.
So, my name is Sara Baumann, otherwise known as Sparky. People generally know me from the Web3 space. I started a NFT brand called Women and Weapons with my husband. Prior to becoming an artist, I was actually an occupational therapist. However, art has been something that I have done my entire life. And it wasn't until probably maybe 2 years into COVID that I decided to make the leap into becoming a full time artist. And it's now one of the things that I have a lot of interest in speaking about is, changing your career and following a path that you're passionate about because you can ultimately make yourself successful whenever you're passionate enough and you're willing to put in the work. So I've been functioning as a full-time artist for about 4 years now, and I have not looked back.
And I met you through obviously through the Web3 space. I kind
Yes.
of got into the space. I think that was 2021.
Yes.
For me, it was through VFriends, right?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, everybody that gets in through VFriends is like the kindest, most wonderful human.
Yeah,
So
exactly,
that
exactly.
makes complete and total sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I got in, started looking around, started seeing different artists, and you were someone that was just like, okay, what she's doing is pretty cool, right? And then you follow, and then you keep watching the person, and you've become like one of my favorite artists in the space.
Oh, thanks, friend.
Yeah, definitely because of your art itself, but also just because of kind of the person you are. You have
Thank
like
you.
a very positive, kind energy. Um,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
for sure, for sure. And as I was thinking of starting this interview series podcast, leading up to my book, I was like, I definitely have to interview Sparky for sure. So just to give some context is, as you know, I've written a few books.
Yes,
My fifth book,
and they're
and
mostly on my bookshelf.
yo, thank you. And we spoke about this earlier, where you don't necessarily know what you're creating until it's kind
Yeah,
of done, right?
yeah,
And the same thing with writing. Like every week I write a newsletter. I think it makes sense, right?
yeah.
And
It hails from somewhere deep within that subconscious that's trying to parse out, bits and pieces of the world, and, it all comes out at some point in time, and that's your way of kind of, I guess, parsing through what it is that you're experiencing.
yeah. So the book is around finding meaning, right?
Yes.
It hasn't fully crystallized. I've written a few things, few words that I've put aside for now, but I was like, let me go talk to, some artists, some entrepreneurs, people that are building in the space. And the main question is just around how, with technology evolving the way it is, right?
Yes.
We find a lot of people find meaning through work,
Hmm.
through family, connections, but primarily, especially in the US, primarily through work. Like, I'm
Yes.
doing
Yeah.
this is my output, this is who I am. And a lot of that is possibly going to change in the next 20, 30 years because of automation. And I'm kind of just here thinking, like, okay, what are some of the best practices that builders, entrepreneurs, artists
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
that we're having using these practices from time, and how can we kind of extend that into the future in
Right.
terms of helping people find meaning, right?
Yeah. It's
And
phenomenal.
you're someone that switched careers, right?
Yes.
You're a prime example of that. So the main thing is mainly around how do we help people find and sustain meaning
Hmm.
through kind of like daily practices they can do within and outside work.
Right.
How do you find meaning through your work?
Yeah, I think it's a lot kind of how you mentioned earlier, where oftentimes you don't necessarily know what the meaning is behind something until you're like close to finished or halfway there or something of that sort. I think for me, with most of my collections, so let's say, for example, my women weapons collection, I knew that I wanted to put out this dichotomy of this like feminine 1950s, 1960s woman who oftentimes in the media or in advertisements was portrayed as being lesser than, a woman that's meant to be quiet and stay in the kitchen. I liked the juxtaposition of that woman with a very strong, traditionally masculine weapon. But as I was working on the pieces, I realized that it was more than just using the metaphors and the symbols of, the strength and the power behind weaponry and women, but it was also kind of tied to probably things that I had seen in the past, documentaries on World War II era about how World War II actually gave a lot of women independence because it gave them the opportunity to work in factories and be, the primary contributors while men were at war. But I also saw it kind of as something that, historically men have a tendency to kind of fetishize weaponry, right? They have a tendency to like hold control over it. It's a symbol of their masculinity. Well, oftentimes I think women and the woman who is on a man's arm is a very similar sort of situation. And so that was another reason why I wanted to kind of put side by side these two items because they were very different in many respects, but also very similar in a lot of respects. And I think I didn't really realize a lot of that until I was probably close to the end of that collection. And I've come to find that with the majority of my collections, whether it be my heritage collection, which you can see a little bit of it over
Yep.
here, or my sensory collection, which is over here, all of them have started with a inkling of an idea and come out with a, ah, yes, this is how I am perceiving the world and perceiving what's happening around me and like psychologically digesting it to then try and explain it to the world from my perspective.
Got it.
And I think that's something very similar to what you do with your writing as well.
Yeah, yeah. So, Sarah, like one thing when people ask me, "Hey man, you're always writing," like, and they're like, "How do I start?" And I
Yeah.
used to say this thing like, like the Nike commercial. I was like, "Hey, just do it. Just sit down and write." And I thought that was because that's what I do. I thought that would be something that clicked with a lot of people. But people start and they're just like, like useless advice somehow, right? Just do it kind of thing. So how do you think through your kind of formulating the stuff as you're going? How do you have the courage to keep going? Like, because it requires, in my opinion, some courage to be like, I don't know what's going on, but I'll figure it out. Where do you find that?
Think it ultimately boils down to what you're passionate about. I think that it's very, very hard to force yourself to continuously do something that you find that you don't have passion for. That's when it becomes monotony. And we get very bored from monotony. I think from a very young age, I recognized that art was my passion and art was my way of explaining my worldview to the viewer. Um, Now, if you asked me to say, do graphic design and just sit down and get started somewhere, I could see myself enjoying it, right? And I could see myself doing it for a year or so, but I could see it becoming a job to me and becoming monotonous. And that's kind of similar with healthcare for me. I loved helping people. I loved doing good in the world. I loved making a positive impact, but ultimately it wasn't my passion. And I think that's a huge reason for why I burned out. So I think you're right in saying yes, just get started, because I think for people that don't already know what their passion is or where their passions lie, that gives them an opportunity to test various things out and find their passions. You have to get started. You have to find out if it's something that you're really passionate about, if you really, really love it or not. And if not, then move on to the next thing that you feel potentially could become something that you're very passionate about.
Exactly, exactly. And tell me a little bit more about in the healthcare industry. Like, what exactly was the role? What were you doing? And how did you think about what you were doing compared to what's the arts and the stuff you were passionate about at least?
Yeah. Yeah. So prior to being a full time artist, I worked as an occupational therapist. I worked in outpatient therapy initially, predominantly treating like ortho related injuries, hand injuries, and then a lot of stroke patients as well, or neuro based patients. Around COVID, our outpatient facility actually closed down. And so I navigated over to entirely acute care, which I had been kind of dabbling back and forth in between acute care and outpatient, as some hospitals often do. So I entered acute care, and acute, I was generally bopping around anywhere between ICU, the neuro unit, the orthopedic unit. It just depended, what month it was, which hospital I was at. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of all over the place whenever I was in healthcare. So a very different experience, but
Mm.
also one that I think kind of weirdly enough, because they're very two different parts of the world almost, being healthcare and art. They did blend together a little bit, because I found that the empathy that I gained as a healthcare professional and the patience that I gained for people and the ability to be transparent and thoroughly explain things to people also works very importantly in the art world.
And it's interesting you say that. Like, so my background is engineering, right?
Yes.
I started expressing myself more through music when I started making beats. You can see kind of like my setup back there. And then I started writing, right?
Yeah.
And it really helps in the entrepreneurial journey where you have to communicate, all that kind of stuff. But one thing I would say when I look back at my engineering background is some kind of systematic thinking that
Mhm.
helps me now in terms of kind of the structure and that I bring to like writing or whatever it is. But back then it just helped me be a professional, to be honest. Like that was the main thing.
Honestly, one of the truest things that you could say, because I find that there's a lot of people that are in the art world that don't necessarily have like the professional etiquette.
Exactly.
You know, spot on. Also, funny enough, my dad is an engineer and he's also a really good writer. There's
Like,
got to be something connected there.
yeah. So in terms of your art, right? What does your medium allow you to express that words or logic don't?
Yeah, I think whenever it comes to art, one, first and foremost, is it does allow the viewer an opportunity to gain their own meaning from the piece. And so I think that's something that's very special about art, because it's not necessarily a overt explanation of what it is that the artist is saying, but rather people can also garner their own meaning from the pieces. And sometimes I think that's really important and very enlightening for people. But I also think part two is for somebody who's like myself, that I'm not the best with words, I'm not the best with writing. And oftentimes I have a tendency to think in images as opposed to capability to verbalize things. Whenever there's concept things that I struggle with in my head, they generally come out much better as imagery than they
Mm,
do in any other form
mm,
factor, whether it be auditorially or written or, any other way that somebody might consume. This has been my form of language, has been painting, has
eh,
been digital illustration, has been, you know, um, live artworks and so on
yeah.
and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. And have you come to a place where you're like, this is what I'm trying to communicate, right? Or is it clear to you? I'm writing my newsletter for almost 3 years now. And people ask me, so what is your newsletter about? And sometimes I still struggle to explain it, right? Because for me, it's like, it's just coming to me.
Yeah.
Do you find a similar struggle or do you have a clear, like, this is what I'm expressing through this language?
Well, I think humans are complex psychologically. And so I think it's natural to not always need to hone in on one specific, tunnel of what it is that you're trying to convey. I think for me, the way that that is similar to your experience is that not all of my collections convey the same sort of message. It has a tendency to convey what I'm feeling, thinking, experiencing at the moment. So, Women and Weapons, I mentioned earlier, my heritage collection
Mm,
was very much based off of what was happening in Iran in 2022, what happened in Iran in 1979, and my wish and want to educate people, predominantly
mhm,
educate. And then we have my sensory collection, which is over there, that has kind of stemmed from I guess my distress associated with always having to be behind a screen, whether it be my iPad, my phone, my laptop, the television, whatever it is, and really missing that sensory experience, the feeling of a brush on the canvas, the feeling of the wind in my face, the feeling of being in a space that's too loud and there's too many people surrounding me, and realizing that we're starting to lose more and more of that sensory experience. So that's kind of what tapped in that collection. And then now I have a new collection called Flora and Fauna, which is portrays a lot of animals,
Yep.
right? It's predominantly about relationships, and that stems from I think my reflection throughout pregnancy, my reflection of my relationship with my husband, with my in-laws, with my mother, with my friends, and how the relationships have evolved and how they continue to evolve throughout our lives. So it's not one specific tunnel that it is that I'm trying to convey a specific message. It's kind of like the tunnel is ever evolving dependent upon what my life experience is. And I think that's okay. Not everybody has to use the same template. I don't know why we feel like we always have to use the same template as one another. That's what makes the world boring.
Yeah, I completely agree. Was your 1 minute elevator pitch? Was your 30-second elevator pitch? And it's just like not everybody has a pitch. Like,
Yeah.
and it changes with time and with whatever you're working on and your interest. Which then brings me to a next question. What practices do you take, right, to stay aligned with your taste in a noisy environment and even noisy? And I'm even talking about the more digital, noisy environment where things are moving so fast.
Yeah. I think probably one of the biggest things is stepping away. So I don't know if you've ever listened to the podcast called The Founders Podcast. Okay, so it's a podcast where the host basically regurgitates books about or written by various founders throughout the course of history. I mean, it can go back super far or it can be very recent. And kind of one of the threads, the common threads in a lot of these founders books is that a lot of them will put themselves in a sensory deprivation kind of experience to recenter. And I think that that's something that I often do as well as a creative and like through the noise of just, the world being as chaotic and as 24/7 as it is today is I will step away from that digital world and I will go visit a museum. I will go to a park. I will go to the arboretum. I will just digitally unplug for like 2, 3, 4 days, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I find that oftentimes that gives me like a really solid recentering because there's just too much happening in my head whenever you're so planted in front of, this digital 24/7 information overload situation.
Yep.
And so sometimes just that deprivation gives you a lot of clarity.
And do you have any go-to practices you do during these times of stepping away?
Yeah. I wish I was a meditator. I'm way too ADD to be a meditator. My husband's great at it. I'm terrible at it. But for me, usually it's going for a walk. That's one. And then part two is if it's nice enough outside because I live in Texas and it's too hot
Mhm.
here, is going to the arboretum. There's something about being around flowers, nature, water,
Water.
things like that that just really centers me.
Mm.
And so, though a lot of those things not be at home, they're near enough to home, especially, just going outside for a walk is near enough to home and it's accessible enough that it's something that I can do to just kind of like switch that flip and turn things off. Yeah, and I live in Dallas, I
Mhm.
live in a busy city, so if I need that sensory deprivation, sometimes the best time to go for a walk is late in the evening, early in the morning, whenever you're not gonna have to walk past your neighbors and say hello or hear horns honking or
Tell me about it. I live downtown Los Angeles and it's constant, like
Oh, I
there's
believe it, yeah.
constant like helicopters flying, sirens going past, like
Yes, it's a lot. I mean, it's funny that you say that because, my husband and I went to Asheville, North Carolina 2 years ago for our anniversary, and we went to the top of one of the mountains in Asheville, and I realized how silent it was. It was so silent that it was, like, deafening, and it was probably one of the most peaceful things I've ever experienced in my
yeah,
entire life, just that absolute calm. Yes.
yeah,
You
yeah,
don't
yeah.
realize how overwhelmed you are
Mhm.
24/7 until
Mhm.
you experience that just severe quiet. It's amazing.
Yeah. Is that something you search for? Does it happen naturally?
Yeah, I think so obviously I'm an occupational therapist, which I think allows me to identify when I'm like sensory overload, And so a lot of times I'll have documentaries on. I'm a big history buff, but sometimes I do feel like suddenly I am like overwhelmed sensory wise. And so
Mhm.
I might move my canvas to another room, turn off the TV, and just experience complete and total silence while I work. And I find that it's kind of like, have you ever heard about how a person who might be deaf might have better vision
Yeah.
or vice versa with the
Yep.
vision and the hearing? It's kind of the same sort of thing. Like, if I take out all the other sensory clutter, I find that I'm able to kind of hone in and really think with more clarity about where I'm going and the trajectory that I'm
Mhm.
heading in.
And it's interesting you said that. I was reading a book and about senses, right? Our senses and how like Western culture is very visual. Like
Yes.
most of our sense in the West, in the US, Europe is very visual. Like
Yeah.
even when we start talking about, the LLMs and all the AI stuff, is text, which is visual. Yeah, there's multimodal stuff, which is also visual, like in terms of like images. So, there are certain cultures where senses are stronger. I don't really use my nose to
All
figure
that
stuff out
often.
as
Yeah.
much, except for like when I'm eating, I'm like, oh, it smells good. Besides that, I don't know if I use my nose enough,
Well,
right?
or
So,
your touch, right? Like,
yep.
it's different, I think, for you probably being in the city in LA, you're not experiencing as much of, like, brushing against a tree or the
Yeah.
feeling of your feet on grass versus
Mm-hmm.
concrete and so on and so forth, so you tend to hone in a little bit more so on that visual and auditory experience
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the, olfactory experience, the tactile experience, and what have
Mhm.
you.
And do you think we're losing a lot by not using some of our other like senses? Do you think as a human experience, it's even as we're becoming more digital, like most of the digital stuff is
Mhm.
visual, right? Do you think we're losing much if we're not tapping into some of the other three main senses, taste and touch?
I I think biologically, we have a tendency to use it or lose it naturally. That's just how the body has a tendency to function. That's how we've evolved over thousands of years is that, if it was a item on our bodies that we didn't need, we often lost it because it was just an additional expenditure of energy.
Mhm.
And I think that it's probably very similar with what we're experiencing now. I think will we experience in totality in our lifetimes? Unlikely, because evolution generally takes multiple generations. But I have a feeling that we probably have a tendency to ignore certain senses more than others.
Yep.
And unless you actively force yourself to tap into it, so for example, your sense of smell, your sense of
Hmm.
taste, sense of tactile experience, unless you're forcing yourself to tap into it, chances are high that you're going to as a habit, rely on the visual and the auditory stimuli. So it's all about being aware of yourself and your surroundings and what's happening so that you don't lose that.
Lose it. Yep.
So, i.e., like, I don't know if you've heard, like, some people go on walks and they do like a color challenge where they have to look for colors or
No.
they have
Okay.
to, like, yeah, smell for different flowers or tree types or so on and so forth. And so there's different training methods I think that people can do to force their brain to continue to tap into, these various different things that they experience, whether it's
Yeah.
going for a walk and picking up, 2, 3 rocks and just feeling the texture of the rocks or touching a tree or touching a leaf or whatever it may be. There's a lot of ways that I think we can continue to stay fresh in that regard in a very digital world.
Yeah. I remember like 2 years ago, I don't know if it's still happening now. Every Saturday in crypto Twitter, touch grass,
Grass. I'm like,
touch
I mean,
grass.
I feel like I'm especially being 9 months pregnant, I feel like I'm at home, like, so much right now because I
Hmm.
waddle everywhere I go
Hmm.
that I'm like, yeah, I need to regularly, like, force myself to just remember I need to touch grass, not
That's,
be
yeah.
behind the laptop or the iPad or whatever, like, I need to go out and do something associated with the external world.
External world. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So Sarah, I've seen you do your arts, right? But I've also seen you explore AI. How do you think about it? They're the purists, right? In my opinion, where they're like, oh, don't use this stuff, right? I see it in the
Yes,
writing
always.
space. Don't use this stuff. Like I want to go write in the cabin somewhere. Cool.
Yes.
And then there are the other ones on the other side where it's just like, I can finally create art. I'm just going to prompt it once and start sharing whatever happens. I'm not even going to kind of iterate with the process.
Mm.
What role does technology and AI crypto play in you doing your art and making sense of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I've mentioned previously, we're very fluid and we're always kind of in this need of evolution, kind of as artists, as people, as humans. And I think for me, it's something that I will always explore. I will always be exploring whatever the burgeoning technology is because I think it's important. I think that there's a lot of importance to being first or at the very beginning of a new frontier, immense asymmetric upside. And I know for me as an artist, I may not be making just straight up AI art. However, I've found that it has significantly improved both the efficiency and the productivity of my practice, whether it's assisting me with writing, whether it's assisting me with applications for various art fairs, whether it's assisting me with just even answering questions like, what medium of paint would be best to
Mm-hmm.
use for me trying to execute this sort of look that I'm
Yep.
trying to go for. And so I think for me, it's always going to be something that I dabble with. It's always going to be something that I'm interested in. AI and crypto are kind of what's hot and what's interesting now, or I should say AI and blockchain
Yep.
in relation to what I do. But whatever's the next thing on the horizon, I'm also going to use it. I think there's a lot of people that are in the traditional art world, and there's a lot of people that are in the digital art world that say,
Mm-hmm.
I will never
Yep.
blend with that other cohort. And personally, I don't find that to be a solid way to look at things. Look at all the people that hated photography whenever photography came out.
Yep.
It was going to take away
Exactly.
from painters. Look at all the people that hated Photoshop when Photoshop came out. It was going to take away from these other practices.
Exactly.
But they all become kind of essential tools of our working nature and something that, helps us improve with our productivity and allows
Mm-hmm.
us to kind of create more efficiently, create maybe more creatively in some respects. And I never want to be the person that's like the last one on the ship
Yep.
because I think that's how you get left behind.
Just looking big picture now, what do you think the artist is trying to express? Right? We've been doing art ever since. That's one thing I feel like is not changing. Our
Yeah.
need to express. Is it more personal expression or is it more trying to connect with people? I've always thought about this as a writer. Is like, okay, I'm writing for myself in the moment to kind of experience this flow state,
Yeah.
try to make sense. But I also want to, after it gets to a point where then I now wanted to connect with people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a similar thing or do you start with connecting with people first and then you create what are we really doing here? What are we trying to
Yeah.
express?
I think in my regard, it's predominantly about explaining something. That's a lot of where a lot of my artwork purpose comes. But I think that it's not that binary for the majority of artists. I think it has a tendency to be more so on a gradient or a spectrum. So I think you're always going to find people that are trying to elicit a message. I think there's probably a lot of people that are in it for the popularity of it and
Mhm.
for the headlines that are going to be associated. I think there's going to be people that are seeing it as exclusively a monetary, career. And so they're going to make things that are very commercially applicable. They're not going to put, immense meaning behind something. They want it to be aesthetically pleasing because they have it kind of purpose built for that specific silo. And then I think that there's going to be people who make art that is very purposefully meant to tell a story or meant to communicate something. And so I think it's very much like I mentioned, on a spectrum. It's not
Mhm.
as binary as it's just for me or it's just for you or so on and so forth. I think that there's a lot of different reasons behind it for a lot of people. And I also think of art kind of like as a timeline for a lot of people. Like sometimes you might see smaller artworks coming about from an artist and oftentimes you might find that that is directly associated with harder economic times when people
Mhm.
could not afford as much in relation to their artworks. You may find that some artwork periods are much more political, and that's oftentimes whenever there's more political turmoil
Yep.
happening
Yep.
surrounding people. And so everything kind of I think is reflective a bit of a timeline in that regard also.
So, do you have any symbols, tools, or rituals that you take daily into your creative process?
Well, I will tell you right now, I'm Iranian. So
Mhm.
naturally, symbols and superstition are very big for me and my culture. So yes, absolutely do. Whether I think directly recognize a lot of those, maybe not, but I would say probably a pattern maybe that I have a tendency to gravitate towards is that I generally don't work on a lot of my artwork until like almost after 3 or 4 p.m. And the reason for that being is because cannot I cannot be disrupted whenever I'm painting or making art.
Mhm.
The disruption severely disrupts the flow, and for
Mhm.
me, I think that's a little bit of a it's like a taboo, I guess. So that's how it that portion of it is for me, but I also have a tendency to use a lot of symbolism in my artwork. So there's usually a lot of reasons behind the colors that I utilize, behind the specific item that I utilize. So
Yep.
the artwork that I created for this show called Shams that was here in Dallas,
Oh yeah, I saw that.
yeah, basically every single song
Hmm?
that happened had different symbols in the artwork that were meant to reflect either Shams Tabrizi or Rumi or like whatever it was that they were experiencing at the time. So I'd say that I play a lot with symbols and kind of taboos and
Hmm.
superstitions and so on with my creative process.
Okay, okay. And how do you get into that undisrupted flow state? Do you have any practice that kind of kicks you into that state?
I think this is going to be a way too scientific answer, but I think it's partially just ADD. I think people with ADD like myself, we're all over everywhere all the time. We're everything everywhere all at once type humans,
Hmm.
right? Until we hone into something that we're passionate about and then we are so zoned into that
Locked
black
in.
hole that we can't escape from it. And I think that's exactly what happens to me. I get started at 3 or 4 PM, and I cannot exit the black hole until, like,
Got it.
11, and so, outside of pregnancy, I'd be like, "I'm not eating dinner. That's disruptive. I won't drink water. I will not go to the bathroom. I cannot disrupt this flow that I'm in." And I think a big portion of that is just being, ADD out the wazoo.
Yeah, yeah, just locked in. There's sometimes I'm like, oh, let me just quickly do this. It's just gonna take me 30 minutes, and then 4 hours later, I haven't stood up. I'm still in that place,
Yes,
locked in. Sometimes it's a fear of like, if I stop now, I'm gonna lose
your
this.
moment.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, for me, that's exactly how it is, like, I'm gonna lose that moment, I'm gonna lose that inspiration, and or I'm gonna go to the bathroom, and I'm gonna notice there's a dust bunny in the corner, and then I'm gonna vacuum that up, and then I'm gonna be like, "Oh my god, there's a mess on the counter, I've gotta wipe that up. Oh, shoot, I was supposed to ship this package, I better go do that and print out the label." And next thing
yeah.
you know, 4.5 hours later, I've done
Gone.
everything else in the house other than painting and my paint can is dry. Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's another part of the problem.
yep, yep. All right. I think if the entire world moving forward with automation, right?
Mhm, mhm.
If the world went dystopian, dark, a few people have power, all the money,
Yeah,
everybody else is just scrambling to work around all these machines, right? That's dystopian or utopian,
yeah.
right? Where we're all in this fair and equal society, helping one another. We don't even have to work, there's universal basic income. All the machines are doing all the work and taking
Yeah.
care of us, right? What would be your daily practice to find meaning in your own life? What would that look like for you? That just a daily practice of finding meaning.
Think in either respect, it's going to be connecting with living and breathing things. So one of the things that brings me so much joy is bringing a smile to somebody else's face, whether that's helping them out at the grocery store, helping somebody online, doing something for somebody and not expecting any sort of like a monetary return. But I also love animals, and so oftentimes connecting with animals gives me immense meaning. And then again, doing the things that I'm passionate about, like artwork, gives me immense meaning. And the fact that, many of us are already kind of aware of what things give us meaning allows us to hopefully tap into that, even in a society where everything is, doom and gloom and or everything is butterflies and rainbows, but it's also everything is butterflies and rainbows. So it's hard to find
Mhm.
variation in that. I think always just connecting with something living because there's going to be sadness, there's going to be joy, there's going to be, a variety of different emotions and experiences to kind of reflect on.
Got it. These are very quick yes, no type questions. All right.
Okay.
All right. AI or blockchain?
AI,
Pencil or marker?
pencil,
All right. Light blue or navy blue?
light blue,
All right. Cowboys or Mavericks?
Mavericks.
Okay, I'll give you
That's hard. That's a hard one. They're both bad right now.
I'll give you an easy one then. Luca in Dallas or Luca in
Luca and Dallas.
all right. Canvas or iPad?
Canvas.
As you know, I'm interviewing as many people as possible, entrepreneurs, designers, builders, artists in the space. If there was one person you want me to interview, right, that you could think of, who would it be?
I think it would be Jen Stark. If you're familiar with her, she's an artist as well. And I feel like she's one of those people that gives her life a lot of meaning. She gives her artwork a lot of meaning. You can tell that she's a very jovial type of human. And she's always seeking out like really interesting experiences. And I feel like she gives her life a lot of like color by doing that.
Mhm.
And so I guess my biggest question to her would be how did she hone in on what it is that she needs to seek out in order to give her life so much meaning and so much joy. And she's built an incredible career for herself that I think would be really fascinating to learn from. And she's given me some tips as an artist that I have put in my brain bank and I have
Mhm.
utilized over and over and over again. And so I do think that she could be a very helpful bit of information, I think, for a lot of people.
Thank you very much for getting on this interview with me. As usual, the information here was top notch. Like, I'm looking forward to like listening back at everything that you said, and I'm wishing you all the best. Like, I know, life is getting more amazing for you, your family, for you, Jake, and just know that people like myself are always supporting from a distance. So just keep doing your thing, and thank you for the time.
Thank you for the time. I appreciate you so much, Nafemi.
Hope